They found Colton Reeves under a toppled hay baler on September 19, 2016, and every farmer in Toombs County agreed. The latch must have given out. Equipment failure. Nobody's fault. I believed them. For 9 years, I believed all of them. My name is Knox Hatcher. I'm 34 and I run a landscaping crew out of Vidalia, Georgia. Colt was my best friend since the 4th grade, and until last spring, I thought he died in an accident on the Pemberton farm. Then I found a wooden shipping crate with Colt's initials carved into the side, C-A-R, sitting in a packing shed that should have been emptied 9 years ago. The bottom was black with old blood. And Leland Pemberton, the man who owned that farm, was standing 30 feet away watching me hold it. The look on his face wasn't surprise. It was calculation. And there was a voicemail, 47 seconds long. Colt's mother had it on her phone for 9 years, her son's voice begging somebody to stop, and another voice answering him. This story destroyed friendships I'd had since childhood, cost me 11 contracts in 3 months, and put me on the wrong side of a town I loved. But I need you to hear it. Hit subscribe and turn on notifications, because what Leland Pemberton said to me in his driveway, the exact words he used about Colt, that's coming. And what I found buried in the county coroner's files is worse. Drop where you're watching from and what time it is right now. I want to know who's here for this. But first, I need to take you back to March of 2025, the morning I pulled into the Pemberton property with a truckload of crepe myrtles and no idea what I was about to find. I'd been running Hatcher Landscapes for 6 years by then. Small operation, me, 2 guys, a trailer. Most of our work came from the big onion farms around Vidalia. Planting borders, clearing drainage ditches, maintaining the properties around the packing houses. Honest work. Steady. The kind of thing where you know every client by first name and they wave you through the gate without asking. Leland Pemberton was one of those clients. The Pembertons had been growing Vidalia sweets since his grandfather's time. 1,200 acres of sandy loam running from Route 1 almost to the Altamaha River. Leland was 61, broad-shouldered, the kind of man who shook your hand hard enough to remind you he could. He donated the scoreboard at the high school. He sponsored the Onion Festival float every April. His wife taught Sunday school, and his crop leases kept about 40 families in Toombs County employed, directly or indirectly. You need to understand that part, the leases, because that's the chain. If you farmed in the county, there was a decent chance you leased your acreage from a Pemberton trust. If you packed onions, you probably ran them through a Pemberton contracted cold storage. If you hauled produce, Leland's fleet manager scheduled your loads. It wasn't a monopoly. It was just how things were, how they'd been for decades. There was a section of fence along the south property line that looked newer than everything around it. Fresh cedar posts where the rest were weathered gray. I didn't think anything of it then. Just figured he'd had some repair work done. I didn't think about any of that. I thought about crepe myrtles and invoice payments, and whether my truck would pass inspection in July. That morning in March, I was planting along the south fence line near the old packing shed, the one they hadn't used since 2019 when Leland built the new cold storage facility off Highway 280. Nobody went back there anymore. It was just corrugated tin and kudzu. But I needed to run a water line, and the closest spigot was behind that shed. So I walked around back. The door was half open. Inside, crates. Dozens of old wooden shipping crates from the original Pemberton operation. Most of them had the farm stencil, but one, near the back wall, had something different. 3 letters carved into the top slat. C-A-R. Colton Arthur Reeves. I knew those letters. Colt carved his initials into everything. Lunch trays, fence posts, the dashboard of his Tacoma. It was a thing he did. His pocket knife, 3 quick strokes, like signing his name. I picked up the crate. It was heavier than it should have been. And the bottom, the underside, was stained dark brown, almost black. The wood had absorbed it. I didn't know what I was looking at. Not yet. I just stood there, holding it, and I remember the shed smelled like old fertilizer and rust, and the light was coming through the tin panels in lines. And then I heard gravel crunch behind me. Leland Pemberton was standing at the edge of the shed, hands in his pockets, wearing a green Carhartt jacket, even though it was already 70 degrees. He looked at me. He looked at the crate, and then he said, real calm, "That shed's not part of your contract, Knox."
I set the crate down.
I said I was just looking for the water hookup. He pointed me toward the spigot on the east side, which was twice as far, and watched me walk away. My two guys were loading mulch bags by the trailer. I was maybe 10 feet past them when Leland called out, loud enough that both of them looked up. "Hey, Knox, you're a good worker. Don't go getting curious about things that don't concern you. Curiosity's an expensive hobby for a man with a small business." He said it the way you tell someone to drive safe, friendly, almost warm. And then he smiled, that church deacon smile, and walked back toward the main house. One of my guys looked at me and said, "What was that about?" I said, "Nothing," because that's what you say in Vidalia when a Pemberton talks to you like that. I should have asked about the crate. I didn't. I went back to planting crepe myrtles and told myself it was old farm equipment, blood from livestock maybe, something normal. But I kept seeing those 3 letters, C-A-R, carved the same way Colt always did. In a shed on the property where he died. Colt died on a Monday. I remember because I'd texted him the night before about fishing that Wednesday. He never responded. His mother, Ruth Ann, called me the next morning. I was 25. She was, I don't remember what she sounded like exactly, but I remember she said his name twice. Colton, Colton. And then she told me, hay baler, equipment failure. The latch on the lift arm gave way and the whole thing dropped on him while he was working underneath it. The funeral was that Thursday. Half the town came. Leland Pemberton sat 3 rows behind Ruth Ann and wore a dark suit and wiped his eyes during the hymn. His hand moved to his watch first, just for a second, before the handkerchief came out. I remember thinking, he cared. The man Colt worked for, he actually cared. After the funeral, people said the usual things. He was too young. God's plan. At least it was quick. And then, slowly, people stopped saying anything at all. Wait, I skipped something. Before the funeral, no, it was after, the day after, Ruth Ann went to the sheriff's office. She told them the baler had been serviced 2 weeks before Colt died and there was no mechanical reason for the latch to fail. They said equipment malfunctions happen. She asked to see the incident report. They told her there wasn't one. Farm accidents didn't require a formal report unless OSHA was involved. The sheriff's department was stretched thin back then. 3 deputies covering the whole county. Nobody was going to pull a deputy off meth calls to investigate farm equipment when the coroner had already signed it accidental. And OSHA jurisdiction on seasonal labor was murky. That's the word they used. Murky. It didn't look like a cover-up. It looked like overworked people taking the easy answer. That's what makes it so hard to see, even now. I went to see Ruth Ann a few times after. She lived in a shotgun house on Pinehurst Road with a screened porch, and a garden she stopped watering by October. She kept saying something didn't feel right. She said Colt had called her that Monday evening around 7, left a voicemail, but she couldn't bring herself to listen to it, not then. She said she'd listened to the first few seconds, just his voice saying, "Mama," and stopped. I told her I understood. I told her to take her time. 9 years. She took 9 years. A mockingbird was going off somewhere in the trees behind her house. I remember that, this bird just screaming its whole catalog while Ruth Ann sat there in her kitchen chair with her hands around a coffee mug. Not drinking it, just holding it. But I didn't know any of that yet. Back then I was just a guy who lost his best friend, and I wanted to believe it was an accident because the alternative was something I couldn't handle. So I went back to work. I built my business. I mowed lawns for the same people Colt had picked onions for. And every September 19th, I drove out to Pinecrest Cemetery with a tall boy of Sweetwater 420, that was Colt's beer, and sat in the grass next to his marker for an hour. The thing about a small town is you don't realize how much silence weighs until you start noticing it. And I didn't start noticing it until that crate. After I found the crate, I told myself to let it go. I almost did. But 3 nights later, I was lying in bed and I couldn't stop thinking about the blood on that wood. Livestock blood wouldn't look like that. It wouldn't have soaked in from the bottom, pooled and absorbed into the grain. That looked like something heavy had sat in something wet for a long time. I called Ruth Ann the next morning. I hadn't talked to her in probably 8 months. She picked up on the 4th ring and sounded surprised to hear from me, which made me feel guilty. I told her I'd found something at the Pemberton farm. I told her about the crate and the initials. She was quiet for a long time. Then she said, "He carved those letters into everything." "I know." "Knox, I listened to that voicemail." I didn't understand, I said. "What voicemail?" "The one from the night he died. I finally listened to it, last November, all of it." I asked her what was on it. She said she couldn't talk about it on the phone. She asked me to come over. I drove to her house that afternoon. The screened porch was the same. The garden was different. She'd planted tomatoes, which Colt used to do. She made me sit at the kitchen table and she put her phone on the counter. Before she said anything, she reached across and straightened the collar on my jacket. Just a small tug, the way a mother does. Then she said, "You look thin. When's the last time you ate a real meal?" I said I was fine. She put a plate of cornbread in front of me anyway and said, "Eat that, and then I need you to hear something." She said the voicemail was 47 seconds long. She said for the first 12 seconds you can hear Colt breathing hard, like he's been running or, she paused, or hurt. Then he says, "Mama." Then there's noise, movement, and then a voice. Not Colt's. A voice saying, "Get up." And then Colt says, "Please." And the voice says something else. She couldn't make out the exact words, but it sounded like, "You should have kept your mouth shut." And then the line cuts. She said she played it 9 times. She said the second voice is a man, deep, calm, like he wasn't panicking, like he was handling a task. I asked her if she recognized the voice. She looked at me and said, "I think it's Leland." Have you ever had someone tell you something that rearranges everything you thought you knew? Not just about one thing, about your whole world? Because that's what happened at Ruth Ann's kitchen table. If that kind of moment has ever hit you, where the ground just shifts, tell me in the comments. Because the next part of this story changed everything I believed about the town I grew up in. I asked Ruth Ann to play the voicemail. She did. I sat there with my elbows on her kitchen table, and I listened. The first thing you hear is breathing, ragged, wet sounding. Then Colt's voice, quieter than I'd ever heard it. "Mama." Not calling out, just saying the word, like a reflex. Then there's a sound. I describe it as something scraping on concrete, metal maybe, or wood. Then the other voice, deeper, measured. "Get up." And Colt, I could hear him trying, a grunt, a shuffle. Then, "Please, please, I won't." And the other voice, cutting him off. "You should have kept your damn mouth shut." Then static. Then nothing. 47 seconds. I played it twice more. Ruth Ann sat across from me with her hands folded and didn't say a word. The kitchen was small, but I could hear the refrigerator humming. The voice, the second voice. I'd heard it 1,000 times, telling me where to plant azaleas, telling me the south fence needed regrading, telling me, "That shed's not part of your contract, Knox." It was Leland Pemberton. I was almost sure. I say almost because I wanted to be wrong. I wanted it to be somebody else, anybody else. Because if it was Leland, then everything I thought about how Colt died was a lie. And not just a lie somebody told me, a lie I'd been living inside for 9 years. My first thought, and I should be honest about this, was that it wasn't Leland at all. I ran through other possibilities. There was a former farm foreman who had been let go the summer before Colt died. Colt had mentioned him once or twice, said the man had a temper, said he'd been caught skimming fuel receipts. Deep voice, angry enough to hold a grudge. For about 3 days, I was halfway convinced it was him on that recording. It fit. A disgruntled ex-worker, a confrontation in the dark. But it didn't hold. The foreman had been in Savannah by September 2016. I checked later. And the voice on that recording wasn't angry. It was calm. Calm in a way that only comes from authority, from owning the building you're standing in. I sat with it. I didn't go to the sheriff. I didn't tell anyone. I just went back to work the next day, and the next, and the next. I mowed Leland Pemberton's property borders on a Thursday 2 weeks later, and he came out and handed me a glass of sweet tea and asked about my truck. And I drank the tea and talked about the truck and went home and sat in my driveway for 40 minutes. I was fueling up at the Citgo 3 days later, and I swear I heard that scraping sound from the voicemail, just the pump handle clicking, but my hands went cold. I wasn't ready. I want to be honest about that. I wasn't ready to believe that the man who'd shaken my hand at Colt's funeral, who'd wiped his eyes during Amazing Grace, had killed him. And I wasn't ready to believe that I'd been standing on top of the evidence for nearly a decade.
47 seconds told me everything. 9 years of silence told me more. But I started noticing things. I said, I started noticing things. That's not right. I started letting myself notice things. There's a difference. And that difference is the part that makes me sick looking back. One detail came while I was edging a sidewalk on a Wednesday. Just hit me. Colt's body wasn't found until the next morning. He supposedly died under a hay baler around 7 p.m., but nobody found him until 6 a.m. the following day. A morning shift worker found him, but he didn't work the evening shift. So who was on the property that night between 7 p.m. and 6 a.m.? Nobody. Or nobody who was supposed to be. Another one came later, in the shower of all places. There was no equipment inspection report after the accident. Georgia requires one for any workplace fatality involving machinery. I looked it up. It should have been filed within 72 hours. It wasn't. And then, this hit me hardest, and it hit me while I was eating a sandwich in my truck on a Friday. Colt had told me 2 weeks before he died that Leland was being weird about something. I asked him what he meant. He said, I think I saw something I wasn't supposed to see. And I said, and I can't forgive myself for this, I said, don't worry about it, man. I told him not to worry about it. I spent April and May going through whatever public records I could find, which wasn't much. The death certificate listed the cause as accidental crushing injury, farm equipment. The coroner's name was Dr. Wendell Shively. I recognized the name. Shively's family owned a 100-acre parcel on the east side of town, leased from the Pemberton Trust. I didn't do anything dramatic, I just noticed. I noticed that the coroner who signed Colt's death certificate farmed land he didn't own, land that Leland Pemberton controlled. Then I started talking to people, carefully. Not, I think Leland killed Colt, nothing like that. Just questions. Did you know Colt Reeves? Do you remember what happened in September 2016? Did anyone ever mention the baler being inspected? The smell of cut grass from someone's yard hit me between conversations. Just this wave of green. And for a second I was back at the cemetery sitting next to Colt's marker. Then it passed. The reactions were all different, and that's what got to me. The feed store manager turned chatty when I mentioned September 2016. Too chatty. Started talking about the weather that month, the harvest numbers, anything to steer the conversation away from what I was actually asking. Kept refilling my coffee cup like he could drown the question in hospitality. The woman at the co-op office went rigid. Her voice dropped, and she said, I really can't help you with that, Knox. And the way she said, can't, made it clear she meant won't. She looked toward the back office like someone might be listening. The guy who ran the welding shop on First Street, he got angry, slammed his pen down on the counter and said, Why are you bringing this up now? That boy's been dead almost 10 years. Let it go. His face was red. Not guilty red, scared red. Over and over, different flavors of the same wall, from people who remember what color shirt you wore to the barbecue in 2012. I didn't understand what that meant at first. I thought maybe it was just uncomfortable. Death is uncomfortable. Nobody wants to talk about it. But then I went to see Harlan Greer. Harlan was 78, retired, used to run a produce hauling company before Leland consolidated the fleet contracts. Harlan didn't owe Leland anything anymore. He'd sold his trucks and moved into a house on Meadow Lane and spent his days fishing. I sat on Harlan's porch and asked him about Colt. And Harlan, this old man who had no reason to be afraid of anyone, he looked at his shoes and said, Son, everybody knows what happened to that boy, and nobody's going to say a damn word. Not in this town.
I asked him what he meant by everybody. He said, "I mean everybody. The co-op, the church, the sheriff, the coroner, your own neighbors. They all know. And they won't tell you because telling you means crossing Leland. And crossing Leland means losing your lease, your hauling contract, your place at that table. You understand what I'm saying?" I understood. And that's the moment, that porch, that afternoon, Harlan's voice steady and tired, when I realized I wasn't investigating a secret. I was investigating a silence. I need to stop for a second, because if you found out that every person around you, your neighbors, your church, your sheriff, all knew the truth about your best friend's murder and chose silence, would you keep digging? Or would you protect what you had left? Tell me what you'd do, because I genuinely wonder if I made the right call. Because what Leland said to my face when I finally asked him about Colt, that's next.
I started building a file. I know that sounds organized. It wasn't. It was a cardboard box in my closet with printouts and handwritten notes and screenshots from my phone. The death certificate copy, the missing OSHA report, a list of every person I'd talked to and what they said, or didn't say. A map of the Pemberton property with the packing shed circled in red marker, and a recording of the voicemail. Ruth Ann let me copy it to my phone. I listened to it at night sometimes, headphones in, lying on my couch, trying to hear words I might have missed. The background noise, the scraping sound, Colt saying, "Mama," and that voice, calm, deep, unhurried, saying, "Get up," and "You should have kept your damn mouth shut." I played it so many times I could hear it without playing it. But I still hadn't gone to the authorities. Part of me knew that going to the Toombs County Sheriff with evidence against Leland Pemberton was pointless. Tucker Voss owed his badge to that man. 14 years in office, and Leland Pemberton had donated to every one of his campaigns. So I called the Georgia Bureau of Investigation's tip line on a Tuesday afternoon in late June. I gave them a summary. I gave them the voicemail. I gave them the death certificate and the missing inspection report. The woman on the phone was professional, asked the right questions, said someone would follow up. 2 weeks passed. Nothing. I checked my phone every morning like I was waiting on test results. Nothing. Then, a Thursday in mid-July, I was finishing a job at a property on Lyons Highway, trimming back an overgrown live oak, when a white truck pulled up behind my trailer. Leland Pemberton's truck. He stepped out slow, wearing work boots and a polo shirt, and walked toward me with his hands at his sides. "Knox," he said, "I heard you've been asking around about Colton." I didn't deny it. I said, "Yeah, I have." He looked at the live oak I'd just trimmed. Then he looked at me. "Colton was a good kid who had a bad accident. It was tragic, but it was 9 years ago, and I'd hate to see you throw away everything you've built, your business, your reputation in this community, over something that's already been laid to rest." He paused. "You understand what I'm saying?" I said I did. He said, "Good." And then, and this is the part I still hear when I'm trying to sleep, he said, "You know, Knox, your daddy mowed these same lawns, and his daddy before him. 3 generations of Hatchers doing yard work for the people who actually built something in this county. I'd hate for that tradition to end because one of you got confused about his place. 3 generations of Hatchers doing yard work." He said it with a smile, like he was doing me a favor by reminding me, if you heard a man say that to your face about your family, you'd want to remember it. Subscribe and stay with me. What Knox does next is the part nobody expected. I stood there with a pair of hedge trimmers in my hand, and I didn't say a word. He got in his truck and drove off. And I won't lie to you, I went home that night, and I almost quit. I sat on my kitchen floor with my back against the stove, and I called Ruth Ann. She picked up, and I couldn't talk. I just sat there with the phone against my ear, breathing, and she said, "Knox?" And I said, "Yeah." And she said, "I know." We stayed on the line for maybe 5 minutes, neither of us saying much. Then I hung up, and I sat on that floor for another hour. I could feel the linoleum pattern pressing into my palms. My eyes burned, but nothing came. I just sat there with the weight of it, the voicemail, the crate,
Leland's voice calling my family yard workers, and I thought about driving to Pinecrest Cemetery and telling Colt I was done, that I'd tried, that it was too much for one person. The contract started drying up the next week. 3 cancellations in 4 days. No explanations, just, we're going a different direction. By August, I'd lost 11 clients, all of them connected to the Pemberton network. And then the GBI investigator called me back. She said there was a wrinkle. The Pemberton family's land trust was scheduled for restructuring in November. If the trust dissolved and reconstituted, records tied to the property's operational history, environmental audits, employee logs, incident filings, could be legally destroyed as part of the asset transfer. She said November 15th was the deadline. She said, if we can't compel disclosure before that date, we lose access to everything. November 15th. I had 3 months. August was brutal. I had 2 contracts left, a church parking lot and a rental property on Cherry Street. I was making maybe $1,200 a month, down from close to $5,000.
But here's what Leland didn't know. While he was squeezing me out, I was still building that file, quietly, at night, on my kitchen table, with a legal pad and a laptop and the voicemail on repeat. You're probably thinking, why didn't he just leave? Take the voicemail to another county? And yeah, I've asked myself that every day. I'd found the coroner, Wendell Shively. I drove to his house on a Saturday morning. He answered the door in a bathrobe and looked like he hadn't slept in a week. He was 67, retired 2 years earlier, and when I said Colt's name, his face changed. Not blank like the others, something else. He looked afraid. I told him I had the voicemail. I told him what was on it. He didn't say anything for a long time. He started to speak once. His mouth opened, and then he closed it and looked at his hands. Then he invited me in. His kitchen was small and smelled like burnt toast. He sat across from me and put his hands on the table. His fingers were gripping the edge, knuckles white, and he said, I can't talk about this. He picked up a coffee mug, stirred it with a spoon, even though it looked empty, and set it back down. I said, Dr. Shively, the cause of death on that certificate doesn't match what's on that voicemail. He said, I know. 2 words. I know. I asked him why he'd signed it as accidental. He didn't answer. He just looked at his hands. And then he said, and this was so quiet I almost missed it, my family has farmed that land for 31 years, Knox. What do you think happens when I tell the truth? I said, what happens when you don't? He asked me to leave. He said he was sorry about Colton. He said he'd been sorry for 9 years. And then he closed the door. That night, I sat in my truck outside Ruth Ann's house. I hadn't told her about the contracts I'd lost, or about Leland showing up, or about Shively. I didn't want to give her hope if this was going to collapse. But I also knew I couldn't do this alone. The truth doesn't care if you're ready for it. It just needs someone who won't look away. I knocked on her door at 8 p.m. She opened it and looked at my face and said, Come in. I told her everything. The crate, the blood, the conversations that went nowhere, the coroner, Leland's visit, the lost contracts. She listened without interrupting. When I finished, she got up from the table, went to a drawer in the hallway, and came back with a small notebook. Blue cover, spiral bound. Colt's, she said. I found it in his truck after he died. I didn't look at it for years, but after I listened to the voicemail, I read it. She opened it to a page near the middle. In Colt's handwriting, I recognized it, that messy left-handed scrawl. There was a list, dates and initials, 6 entries. The last one was September 14th, 2016, 5 days before he died. Next to each date, Colt had written 2 letters, L.P., and next to each entry, a single word, dumping. Colt had been tracking something Leland Pemberton was doing on the property. Illegal dumping, pesticide runoff maybe, or chemical waste. I'd come back to find out exactly what, but the point was, Colt had seen something he wasn't supposed to see, and he'd written it down. And 5 days after his last entry, he was dead. Are you still with me? Because what's coming next
The part where this whole thing breaks open, I need you to hear it the way it happened. If you've made it this far, stay, because you haven't heard the worst of it yet. And the worst of it is the reason I'm sitting here telling you this. By early September, I'd sent a second package to the GBI. The notebook, a copy of the voicemail, the death certificate, a timeline I'd put together showing every date Colt had logged, every conversation I'd had, every door that closed in my face. This time, someone called back. Her name doesn't matter. She was an investigator from the Vidalia field office, and she told me they'd opened a preliminary inquiry. She couldn't share details, but she asked me to sit tight and not do anything that could compromise the investigation. I said I'd try. For about 48 hours, I let myself breathe. The GBI was involved. Real investigators with subpoena power. I thought, maybe I'd done enough. Maybe the system would handle it from here. I slept through the night for the first time in weeks. I woke up Wednesday morning and drank my coffee on the porch and thought, okay, it's moving. Then I found the dead rat on my truck seat. September 3rd. I'd left my windows cracked because it was 92 degrees. I came back from a job, and there it was. A dead rat, centered on my driver's seat. No note, no explanation. Just a dead animal placed carefully where I'd have to sit. I took a picture. I added it to the box. Sitting tight is hard when you live in the same town as the man you're accusing. When you see his truck at the gas station. When his wife waves at you from across the produce aisle at the Piggly Wiggly, and you have to wave back. Then, September 11th. Ruth Ann called me at 6 a.m. Her voice was shaking. Someone had spray-painted the word liar across her front door. I drove to her house. The paint was red. The letters were large and uneven. Ruth Ann was standing on the porch in her bathrobe, holding a coffee mug with both hands, not crying, just standing there, looking at it. I asked her if she wanted to file a police report. She laughed, not a real laugh. "With Tucker Voss?" she said. "He'd probably write the report and lose it in the same afternoon." I cleaned the door with turpentine and a wire brush. It took 2 hours. When I finished, Ruth Ann handed me a glass of water and said, "Knox." She stopped herself, started over. "Knox, are you sure we're doing the right thing?" I said, "I don't know, but I can't stop." She nodded. "Good, because I can't either." The VFW barbecue was scheduled for September 20th, the day after the 9th anniversary of Colt's death. Every year, the VFW Post 4060 held a community supper. Chicken, slaw, sweet tea, fold-out tables. The whole town came, including Leland Pemberton, who always donated the meat. Ruth Ann called me on the 15th and said she wanted to go. I said, okay. She said, "I want to play the voicemail." I said, "Ruth Ann." She said, 9 years, Knox. 9 years of that man sitting in the same room as me and smiling. I'm done. I told her we should wait for the GBI. She said, "I've been waiting since 2016. And she was right. She'd been waiting longer than I had. She'd been waiting since the morning she heard her son say, "Mama," on a phone message, and stopped the recording because she couldn't bear to hear what came next. September 20th, 2025. The VFW hall smelled like barbecue smoke and pine sol. Yellow fluorescent lights. American flag on the back wall tilted slightly to the left. I don't know why I remember that. Folding tables covered in checkered plastic cloths. Paper plates, styrofoam cups. 73 people. I counted later, but that night it just looked like everyone. Farmers and their wives, kids running between tables, a couple of high school football players in jerseys eating chicken thighs with both hands. Leland Pemberton was at the head table. Of course he was. Green sport coat over a white shirt, talking to the VFW post commander like he owned the building, which technically he did. The Pemberton family had donated the land it sat on in 1987. Ruth Ann walked in wearing a blue dress. She had her purse over one shoulder. She looked calm. I was behind her, and my hands were shaking, and I remember thinking, she looks like she's going to church. She sat down at a table near the center. I sat next to her. People nodded at us. A few said hello. Nobody asked why we were there. Why would they? It was a community supper. At 7:40 p.m., Ruth Ann stood up.
She didn't ask for attention. She just stood. And something about the way she did it, straight-backed, deliberate, made the room go quiet. The conversation stopped in waves, table by table, until the only sound was a ceiling fan clicking overhead. Ruth Ann said, "Most of you knew my son, Colton." People nodded, polite, cautious. She said, "He died 9 years ago yesterday, on the Pemberton farm, and you all told me it was an accident." I watched Leland. His hand stopped halfway to his cup of sweet tea. Ruth Ann said, "I have something I want you to hear." She reached into her purse and pulled out her phone. She'd connected it to a small Bluetooth speaker, the kind you'd use at a picnic. She set it on the table, and she pressed play. 47 seconds. The room heard Colt breathing. They heard him say, "Mama." They heard the scraping sound. They heard the voice, deep, calm, flat, say, "Get up." They heard Colt say, "Please." They heard the voice say, "You should have kept your damn mouth shut." And then nothing. 47 seconds of a dead man's last moments, played through a $6 speaker in a VFW hall on a Saturday night. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. I was watching faces. The feed store manager's wife had her hand over her mouth. The welding shop guy was staring at the table. The woman from the co-op was looking at her husband, and he was looking at the floor. And Leland Pemberton was looking at Ruth Ann. His face was, I don't know how to describe it, white. Not just pale, white. The blood had left it, and his hands were flat on the table, both of them, pressed down like he was trying to hold himself in place. Ruth Ann looked directly at him. She didn't raise her voice. She said, "That's your voice, Leland. I know it. Knox knows it. And now everybody in this room knows it."
Leland stood up. His chair scraped back. He opened his mouth, and for a second, 1 second, I saw it. Something underneath. Not anger, not calculation. Fear, real, animal fear. And then it closed. The mask came back. He said, "This is ridiculous. That recording could be anyone. Ruth Ann, you need help. You've needed help for years." And that's when it happened. A woman at the next table stood up. Her name was Diane Trask. She was 54, ran a daycare out of her home, and her husband leased 80 acres from the Pemberton Trust. I barely knew her. She'd never spoken to me about Colt. She was exactly the kind of person who would never, ever cross Leland Pemberton. She was shaking, her whole body, and she said, "I was there." The room stopped. Diane Trask said, "I was picking up sweet corn from the packing shed that night, September 19th. I heard screaming from inside, and I drove away. And I went home, and I didn't tell anyone because—" She stopped. Her voice broke. "Because we need that lease. My husband, we need—" She sat down. She put her face in her hands. And then something happened that I will never forget. Another voice from the back of the room. Harlan Greer, 78 years old, standing with his cap in his hands. "I knew too," he said. "The morning shift worker told me what he really found that morning. The boy's hands, his hands were wrong. You don't get those injuries from a baler. I knew, and I kept my mouth shut." And then another voice, and another. 4 people, 5. By the time it stopped, 7 people in that room had admitted they knew, or suspected, that Colton Reeves was murdered. 7 people who'd carried it for 9 years because their livelihoods depended on the man who did it. Leland Pemberton stood at the head table and watched it happen. And for the second time that night, I saw the crack. He looked at Diane Trask, this woman who depended on him, who was supposed to stay silent forever, and his jaw loosened, just slightly. And I saw what was in his eyes. He wasn't afraid of the truth. He was afraid of being alone with it. But then the mask snapped back. He pointed at Ruth Ann and said, "You're a bitter old woman who can't let go. Colton was reckless. He was always reckless. And if he'd minded his own business instead of snooping around my property, he'd still be alive." He didn't realize what he'd said, but everyone else did. If he'd minded his own business, he'd still be alive. That wasn't a denial. That was a confession. The room went silent. Complete silence. The ceiling fan clicking. Nothing else. Leland looked around the room. He looked at the faces of people he'd controlled for 30 years, and every single face was turned away from him. He walked out of the VFW hall at 7:52 p.m. Nobody followed him. Nobody stopped him. He just left. The door swung shut behind him, and that was it. I was finishing a job on the south side of town, edging a driveway of all things, when Ruth Ann called. Her voice was different. Light. "They got him, Knox. They arrested him this morning."
October 4th, 2025. 14 days after the VFW supper. Ruth Ann told me the GBI had moved fast once they had the corroborating testimony. Diane Trask, Harlan Greer, 3 others. The charges were murder in the 2nd degree and concealment of a death. I sat down on the curb with my edger still running, and I just sat there. The investigation confirmed what Colt's notebook had suggested. Leland had been illegally dumping pesticide waste in an unlined drainage ditch on the back 40. The runoff was contaminating groundwater that fed 3 neighboring wells. Colt had seen the drums. Colt had confronted Leland about it. Because that's who Colt was. He asked questions. He didn't know he wasn't supposed to. The forensic analysis of the voicemail confirmed the second voice as consistent with Leland Pemberton's voice pattern. They also found a quieter voice in the background. The sheriff's nephew. He'd been 23 at the time, a seasonal worker. He'd helped move the body. He'd helped stage the baler. And then he'd left the state the following month, which the sheriff's office never documented. Tucker Voss resigned 5 days later. The county commission referred his conduct to the state attorney general. Dr. Wendell Shively came forward on his own. He told them about the defensive fractures in both of Colt's hands and forearms, injuries he'd seen and omitted from the death certificate. He surrendered his medical license in November. I heard about it from a neighbor who'd seen it on the local news. I keep going back to those hands, the defensive fractures. He was fighting back. That's the part I can't. Yeah. My landscaping business started getting calls again in late October. Slow. A few old clients who'd dropped me. Some were apologetic. Some just said, "We'd like to reschedule the fall cleanup," like nothing had happened. I took the work. I needed the money. Ruth Ann called me every Sunday morning, same time, 8:15. We'd talk for 20 minutes about nothing. The weather, her tomatoes, what was on sale at the Piggly Wiggly. She never brought up the case unless I did first. She just called. Every Sunday. On December 7th, she called and said, "Knox, I put flowers on his grave today, and for the first time, I didn't feel like I was apologizing to him." I didn't know what to say to that. I just said, "Good." She said, "It is good." Leland Pemberton's trial began in March 2026. The jury took 6 hours. Guilty on both counts. 25 years. He's 62 now. The sheriff's nephew was located in Chattanooga, extradited, charged with accessory after the fact and obstruction. His trial is pending. The Pemberton farm is being managed by a court-appointed trustee. The crop leases are being restructured. 40 families are still farming that land. The onions are still growing. I want to say something to you before I go. Thank you. Telling this story, all of it, the parts that make me angry and the parts that make me ashamed, and the parts I still don't fully understand, it cost me something. And having someone listen to the whole thing is more than most people in Vidalia were willing to do for 9 years. If this story meant something to you, hit the like button. Subscribe if you haven't already, because there are more stories like this. Stories that got buried under silence and stayed there until somebody decided to start asking questions. Here's what I keep thinking about. Who is the person in your life that everybody trusts? The one nobody questions? And have you ever wondered if that trust is earned or if it's just habit? I'll read every answer you leave down there. There's another story waiting right after this one. Click it. Silence has a price. Someone always pays. I was out at the Pemberton property last week. Not for work. The trust hasn't called me yet. I just drove out there. The packing shed is still standing. The door was padlocked. Yellow crime scene tape from months ago,
faded and torn. I stood in the yard for a while. It was late afternoon, warm. The onion fields stretched out behind the shed, green and even, rows disappearing into the haze. I could smell the dirt, that sweet Georgia loam. I got back in my truck, put the key in, sat there. The radio was off. No engine, no wind, just the quiet. I turned the key and drove home.